Recorded Books presents Against the Tide by John Ringo, narrated by Tim Fannin. Chapter 1. The humpback whale cruised slowly northward through the blue waters of the eastern Atlantis Ocean, listening to the sounds of the sea around him. Sound carries far underwater, depending upon its frequency. The humpback did not use sonar, but used the sounds created by other sea creatures large and small to create a three-dimensional map of its surroundings that stretched with decreasing accuracy for a bubble hundreds of miles around. To the southwest were several schools of fish. Birds were diving on them, and tuna were working over one while a school of spiny sharks was attacking another. To the northwest, by the lands of ice, a pod of fellow humpbacks, the ocean's great communicators, were giving their siren calls, embedding in them a constant litany of information. A school of squid was in the deeps below the humpback, but he was neither a pelagic hunter like the sei and blues, to go after the schools to the south, nor a deep hunter like the pod of sperm whales to the west that could make the 500 meters down to the shoal. No, he was an inshore hunter who could gorge on herring for a few weeks and then survive for months on the stored fat. So Bruno told himself. But he was still hungry, and the resupply ships weren't due for another 2 weeks. As he was mentally grumbling to himself and turning to the east to stay inside his patrol zone, he picked up the frantic squealing of Delfino. He listened and then continued his slow and lazy turn until he was pointed in the direction of the distant pod, just sculling along 100 meters below the surface, where the interference from the surface chop dropped off. The sound was attenuated by the distance. The high-frequency pinging of the delfinos dropped off rapidly, even in cold water. But the humpbacks were not merely the loudest whales in the ocean. They had the best hearing. He waited until the sound began to shift, and then surfaced, blasting out the air he had held in his lungs for long minutes, and taking in a deep gulp of cold North Atlantis air. He then dropped back to 100 meters, turned tail up, and began to let out a deep series of throbs, like deep, giant drumbeats that resounded through the ocean. The murre was lying in mud, his hands interlaced behind his head to keep it up out of the glutinous black mass. Asfaw didn't like sitting in mud, but the alternative was swimming back and forth, and that got old quick. He thought to himself, as he had at least 100 times, that he ought to do something about there being nothing but mud down here. But then he reminded himself that writing memos was a pain in the tail, and probably nothing would be done anyway. Support of the murre was a pretty low priority around here, as their quarters proved. So he continued sitting in the mud, lying in the mud, and occasionally playing with the mud through the long watches. As he was contemplating, again, that he'd much rather be back at Blackbeard Base or even out with the scouts, he sat up and cocked his head to the side. He listened for a moment, then blanched, his fair skin turning fairer in the dark waters. He quickly swam to the surface and took a breath of air, using it to blast the water in his lungs out through the gill slits in his ribcage. There wasn't anyone on the floating dock, so he swam over to the ladder and climbed up it, hand over hand, until he could see over the side of the dock. The messenger was sitting on a chair. See, he at least had a chair. His head bowed on his chest. The moon had set, but lantern light was more than enough to see that he was slightly drooling and twitching in his sleep. "Robertson!" the murre snapped. "Wake up!" "What?" the messenger said, sitting up and looking around blearily. "Wake up and get ready to take a message," the murre said. "Yes, sir," the private replied.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.